What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Week 13 cash game review. On today's video, I'll be going over the lineup that I ran on DraftKings yesterday for the Week 13 main slate. Had a pretty decent week, survived a couple of bad plays, or at least plays that didn't work out in retrospect. I survived the weather and, more importantly, was strong enough to stick through some of the tough decisions that the weather, posed to us. There was a ton of noise on socials, on Twitter. I think that it, put doubt into a lot of people's heads and caused people to maybe pivot in some ways that they maybe shouldn't have. I stuck through it, played the lineup that I had planned to play, pretty much from Friday on, because it seemed like most of the injury news was cleared up relatively early on this slate. And I pretty much had my lineup earlier than usual, and I stuck with it. So this was the lineup that I ran. It put up 149.3 points, 170.2% of head-to-heads cashed in 9 out of 10 double-ups. Before I break the lineup itself down, I just want to take a note and look at this one interesting thing that I noticed, in terms of that 1 out of the 10 double-ups I didn't cash in, and I bet some other people ran into this as well. And it's just interesting when you see two double-ups have such differing, results, if you will. So in the $25 single entry double up that has almost 7,000 entries, it's the largest single entry $25 double up that DraftKings posts on a weekly basis. The cash line was at 144.8. In the $25 single entry double up with about 2,200 entries, the cash line was 150.12, much higher, in terms of over 5 points higher. And when you look at that, it's not because there were more people or less people. It was because one just simply had a field of sharper players. Clearly, when you look at ownership, the more optimal plays were stacked in the smaller field than versus the larger field. Now, maybe that's because of when it's posted. I don't really think that there's much of a way for you to look. I mean, you can look through the entrance prior to entering, but unless you know the players, or you're going by experience badges or something, which I don't think is always optimal. In fact, it's not. But I don't know. I mean, you look at it and just some differences. So I'll go larger field versus smaller field. Higbee was 54.6% owned in the larger field compared to 67.7 in the smaller. That's a pretty big difference. McCaffrey, 74.4 versus 85.9. Adams, 56 versus 64. Sanders, 59.6 versus 70.8. Now, so what that means is that the chalk plays that, didn't hit value, McCaffrey, for example, at 74.4 versus 85.9% owned, that hurt you less. But if you had Higbee, 54.6% owned versus 67.7, that Higbee career game is, a lot less beneficial to you. Same thing when there's an 11% difference in Miles Sanders ownership. So, I just think that it's really interesting to note things like that. I think it's more of an aberration than something we need to account for. It's very difficult, I think, to really, it's really difficult to take into account the skill of your opponents unless you have a long standing knowledge of DFS. You know who they are, you know how they play, or you just are going by a metric that I don't think is very predictive whatsoever, like experience badges. But I just thought that was interesting. But I'll get into the lineup itself now and the decisions that led to it. So starting off with quarterback, Lamar Jackson was sub 20% owned in most of the double ups that you looked at. He was less owned than Andy Dalton and just about everyone. And I get it with Andy, coming back, good matchup, 4.7K on DraftKings. Mahomes was owned around the same as Lamar. And, in my opinion, that's just a misunderstanding of the scoring system, because Lamar Jackson for cash games is just so much safer than all of these players because of the way he gets his points. It doesn't matter that Mahomes or even Andy Dalton or, Carson Wentz or whomever you'd like to say has a better chance to get 300 yards and get the bonus, blah, blah, blah. Look, Lamar Jackson should be a cash game lock when you see him at the price 7K. He is as valuable to the quarterback position as Christian McCaffrey is to the running back position because it's a usage thing. Lamar Jackson went over 26 DK points for the 10th time this season. He in 4 of those games, including this last game, he put up 26 with 1 or less passing touchdown. He set, everybody heard, he set the record for 100-yard rushing games in a single season. Nobody's ever done that before. Lamar Jackson is a different beast, and what he's doing has never been seen. The way he plays, it seems it's unstoppable. It doesn't matter the defense. I think we're going to have a really interesting question and conversation to discuss this week, and I'll talk about it on my cash pool video on Thursday as to whether or not Lamar Jackson will be a good play on the road at Buffalo. But I mean, at home, 7K, it was never a question for me. I was never going to pay down to Andy Dalton, and thankfully never paid down to Nick Foles. I didn't actually see what Foles' ownership was in cash games, but I can assume it was higher than it should have been. So moving on to running back here, Christian McCaffrey had his second worst output of the season, scored under 21 DK points for the first time since week 2. It's tough to see. You hate to see it. You think it might bury you, especially at 10.9K. But luckily, he was over 70% owned in just about every double up. Like I said in that at the beginning of the show, he was 85% in some double ups. So the majority of the field felt this just as badly as I did, just as badly as most of you, I'm sure, did as well. And it's not as crushing as it would have been, say, last week if you had played him at sub 10% in cash, because then you would have just been absolutely buried. Or, the 2 weeks prior when he had been 35 to 40%, like that would have sunk most of the field. That would have been the difference, I think. And again, it's not like he scored like 2 points or 3 points. So like, yeah, you can survive obviously a 17-point game. Like that's awesome for a floor. That's why we play him without thinking about it every week. But still, it was just, you'd like to have seen more in a better matchup, but this offense is broken, and I wonder going forward, if they start to lean off of McCaffrey, because the Panthers are just so far gone at this point. The other 2 running backs I played were Miles Sanders and Jonathan Williams. McCaffrey and Sanders to me were locks from, pretty much the top of the week. As soon as Howard was ruled out, it was obvious that Sanders was a slam dunk play. He again dominated snaps. There was no Jay Ajayi revenge game in the cards today. And look, Sanders, this was the 3rd week that he was in cash consideration. It was the 3rd week where, a lot of people were interested in playing him. He had pretty unimpressive results in the previous 2 weeks, but his usage was consistent in both outings. So we knew the results were coming. And finally, if you played him again this week, it paid off. He touched the ball 22 times, 17 attempts for 83 yards and caught 5 of his 5 targets for 22 and a touch. Not much you can say here, despite the Eagles failing miserably in a real NFL sense. Miles Sanders got there, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not they stick with him, over Jordan Howard. I think he is, the superior all-around player, despite how well Howard has actually played in his time here with the Eagles. And then Jonathan Williams, look, I don't really know what to say about this. Yeah, he got abandoned in terms of game script, but look, Jonathan Williams got outsnapped by 2 running backs this time, Wilkins and Hines. And, the 2 weeks prior when he had sort of overtaken this starting role, it didn't really seem like that was a play, in play. I mean, he was coming off of, I think, a 29-touch game last week, and then he sees the field for 16 snaps. Some people in the DFS industry were on this. I was not. I didn't really think it was in the range of outcomes, but obviously it was. And yeah, 5.3K. And look, he completely buried you. Only had 14 rushing yards and 1 reception for 11. 3.5 points. It is what it is. He was shy of 30% owned in double ups. It hurt. I thought it was going to bury me, to be honest with you, going into the late games, having only 1 player left, Tyler Higbee, after what Jack Doyle did in the 1 p.m. games. The only Colt, I guess Zach Pascal actually had a pretty good game, but, the only one that was high owned in cash to really, just completely bury us here. And, shout out to Jonathan Williams. I didn't think he was so game flow dependent, but they just opted to go with Wilkins in this spot. And, I think the team suffered for it. Indy only put up 17 points, and they got pretty much decimated by the Titans. So, it was tough to watch, and there was not really anybody I considered besides Williams. LaShawn McCoy was, I guess, in play as Damian Williams got ruled out, and we thought that maybe he would be the starter. But if you watch that game, Darrell Williams was clearly in line to get more touches than LaShawn McCoy, and that would have been a bust had Darrell not gotten hurt, and then LaShawn McCoy came in and was more productive. And then even then, towards the end of the game, the game was well in hand and they'd completely blown out the Raiders. But even still, they gave Darwin Thompson touches in the fourth quarter. He got a touchdown. So, I think that Jonathan Williams was the play prior to the games. Obviously, it didn't work out. Didn't really account for the Titans smashing completely in this spot. Maybe should have found somewhere else to go. And that was a failure on my part. I'll have to reevaluate and continue to think about this because, Jonathan Williams seemed like a complete smash from the second I opened the slate. Maybe I got too dug in with that and didn't really consider some of these other plays. But, moving on to wide receiver, I played a pretty standard core. I mean, most of them were relatively owned. I guess Conley wasn't as owned as I expected him to be at only 8.8. But I played Adams, Conley, and Shepard. Adams was super chalky, 56% owned, had his fifth straight double-digit target game. Reeled in 6 for 64 and 2 touchdowns. That second touchdown was super clutch because it looked like Aaron Jones was, destined for that. Then they get pushed back on penalty, and Rodgers gets it to his man, and that was great to see. Not too much to say with Adams. I guess, this lineup as a whole, I should have mentioned at the top, had 100 left on the board, and when the weather concerns started to get really, noisy on Twitter, I guess for a moment I considered moving up to Cooper Kupp. I already had that 100, and I thought maybe it was time to get off Adams, but, I stuck with Adams, and, I think maybe he would have been higher owned, maybe in the McCaffrey range, up to 74%, because Adams was the clear best wide receiver play on the board, and maybe some people did get off of him, got over to guys like, Kupp or maybe Mike Evans instead. But, Adams, I wasn't scared of the snow. The Packers are super accustomed to playing in the snow, and the matchup was too good. The usage was too good, and it proved to be a great outing for Adams here. Now, the other two guys I played, definitely shakier. No doubt about it. Chris Conley, I was, thinking about it all day. Should I pivot off of Conley to get down to Auden Tate? And, both Bengals wide receivers were very owned in cash. Auden Tate was over 20% owned in cash. He went for 4 for 66, 10.6 points on DK. Tyler Boyd, even more owned, 31.8% in the massive $25 double up. And he went for 5 for 59 and 16.9 points. I liked Westbrook. I liked Conley. I wasn't super high on Chark, but obviously this Jacksonville game, they got blown out by the Bucks, but the story was that Nick Foles got benched, and I didn't really watch this game that closely because Conley was my only core play here, and they weren't in the red zone too often, so I don't know. It was difficult to predict this, I think. The wind was pretty hectic, and that was the main thing that was giving me pause with Conley. And I guess that the ball could go anywhere, but, I guess I felt the same with Auden Tate, Tyler Boyd. Uzoma could have had a touchdown but dropped it. So, I don't know. I don't feel great about having stuck with Conley, but it just made everything fit. And if you've watched these videos, if you've listened to my cash pool or the podcast, the DFS Dose, I talk about it often. I think the best spot to punt in cash games is tight end and wide receiver 3 because you can always, just pick a guy who has decent upside and a decent floor and just roll with it and hope they hit the higher range of their outcomes because wide receiver is so much more volatile. You always want to lock in those running backs, and this year with a guy like Lamar, I've been prioritizing quarterback more and more. But, since week 7, this is the first time that Conley had under 7 targets. So, again, he didn't really have a great game in terms of his range, and the mid-game quarterback switch isn't something that I really accounted for. I didn't even really think it was on the radar with him. In fact, I thought it was more on the radar for a guy like, Jared Goff, who'd been playing terribly coming into this game and has significant road struggles, which is, even more reason to stick with Adams over Kupp, going back to what I was just talking about. But the third guy I played who had almost identical cash game ownership to Tyler Boyd is Sterling Shepard. And, this this right here is the one play of this, besides I guess Jonathan Williams, that really makes me like question why I made it. Look, Shepard was out targeted by Caden Smith. He was out targeted by Darius Slayton, aka Godius Slayton. And you just hate to see it. He bailed us out with a touchdown early in the game. It looked like we had hit the nuts early in the game with Miles Sanders, Adams, Sterling Shepard all getting touchdowns. Within the first quarter, it was just like, all right, we're sailing to the money today. But, Shepard really didn't do much for the rest of the game and was completely out-targeted. And it hurts my heart because I remember last year I made the same exact mistake when, all of the Giants pass catchers were out, and then all of a sudden it was like, all right, Sterling Shepard time, and then he just never really sees his role get expanded. And Daniel Jones struggled as a whole. I think he had 3 interceptions in this game. He had talked before the game about never playing in this kind of weather, and that doesn't really give you a big, boost of confidence here. I think ideally the switch I would have made was not Conley to Auden Tate, but it would have been Shepard to Auden Tate, and then use that salary to get up from Williams, maybe get onto, I don't know exactly what that would have left me with, roughly 1.1, so somebody in the 6.5 range, maybe go down at defense and find my way up to Fournette or Bell or something, but I was never really on either of those guys either, so I guess, that's why I ended up sticking with this lineup that I ran, and it worked out for the most part. I think the key in general was avoiding landmines like DJ Chark at 22% owned, who only put up 6.7 points. That was a major mistake. And just another quick note here, I think it was really interesting. 18.5% of people opted to play Alshon Jeffrey coming off of an injury. And, I get the spot. I get that Wentz was popping in a lot of optos, but I was just shocked to see Alshon owned at almost 20% and Devontae Parker at about 15%. I wasn't really on either of these guys, and they both had massive games, which I think helped the field quite a bit. And really, I don't know, it was the difference. I never was on either of them. And then looking at tight end, there were really only 2 cash game plays. Look, Kelsey was a great play. Waller, I think, was a great play before the slate. But really in cash games, there were 2 plays you were looking at. It was Higbee and it was Doyle. And I kind of thought that I was buried. I thought that Doyle clearly had the higher ceiling, but Higbee just made everything fit. And for 2.5, the flow chart, et cetera, I thought that Higbee was the play to make. And then Doyle, starts off and just smashes, puts up almost 20 points. And I really thought that we were completely done for going into these 4 o'clock games. Had about 110, a little over 110 points with only Higbee remaining. And then he comes in and he has a career game, and he has 3 for 50 after like 2 drives, and it's just like, all right. Then he gets a touchdown, then he gets the 100-yard bonus, and after it's all said and done, 26.7 points. It's like the 1%, the top 1% outcome on Higbee's range, and we got there. And just shout out to Tyler Higbee, because he really bailed me out in this slate, bailed a lot of people out, I think. And he was super popular, but it was the difference because you paid 800 less for him, and then he puts up over 6 points more than Jack Doyle, full touchdown more. Massive leverage there. So that's just about all I've got on this week. Defense as well. I played the Ravens. It was a toss-up. None of these defenses really, I think, were too impactful. I played the Ravens. The Browns were popular. If I weren't going to play the Ravens, I probably would have paid down for the Cardinals. I thought about, that 2v2 Ravens and Conley versus Cardinals and Westbrook. I think that the latter would have been better, but I stuck with this lineup all along. And yeah, it was a good week. I'm excited to dig into next week. We're really getting into the territory where we're gonna have to start analyzing, the effort level that teams are putting into it. Is Christian McCaffrey, who his price has finally gone down, only 200, but his price has gone down for the first time in over a month, 10.3. Are we going to play him, or is Carolina going to, start to scale him back and get ready for 2020? And that's going to be a big problem across the league going forward. So we're going to have to look into that, and it's going to be really exciting times. It's going to be a time where work and, your ability to digest information and turn that into actionable, use will be rewarded. So yeah, I will talk about that on Thursday when I return with my cash pool video. As always, subscribe on YouTube, blah, blah, blah. But most importantly, follow on Twitter. That is the number one. So I will see you guys on Thursday. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you all cashed this week. And yeah, let's keep grinding. Week 14 ahead.